Hello, everyone, and Merry Christmas. It may be a little early to say that, but because I know it's not technically December yet, but this is the last day of November, so tomorrow will be official, hopefully, if you're one of those Christmas Nazis. But anyway, as you can tell by the background, I am not one of those Nazis. So, Merry Christmas to you. I have not been able to record video in a while because I've been working, which is great for our money situation, but not so great as far as video making. So the reason I have time right now is because I'm actually in quarantine. I feel fine. I don't think that I have COVID, but I have been substitute teaching, and needless to say, one of my students tested positive for COVID after, in the few days after I was in close proximity to them. And so I am officially in quarantine through Friday. So it has been kind of nice, and also it allows me time to be able to record today. So anyway, today's video is kind of unscripted, and this is by no means exhaustive on this topic. It's just something that I've had on my mind, and a lot of people have asked me about, and it seems to be something that either you know about or you don't know about. There's kind of no middle ground. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is the wealth gap. And broadly speaking, what the wealth gap means is, the top percentage of wealth goes to a very small part of the population, and then there's this huge gap, and there's not a lot of middle class. We've seen a decrease in the middle class significantly in the last several decades. It's not probably something to be alarmed about, but it is happening slowly. And when people say wealth gap, a lot of times what they're referring to is the wealth gap between white Americans and people of color, particularly African Americans. There are lots of reasons for this, particularly in the South, and it's all over, it's nationwide, but this particular, when we had slavery, obviously, African Americans that were here were more than likely slaves. Therefore, they couldn't own property, and they had no human rights, basic human rights that we as white people it would have been assumed that we had them. African Americans did not. And so, and then after slavery, they were freed, but then were still discriminated against, both by basic, society, and by laws and policies, like the Jim Crow laws and segregation, laws that kept them from being able to vote. Certain areas and states and all had laws against still land ownership. A lot of places wouldn't hire African Americans, etc. It was very difficult. And then if they did get jobs, particularly in the 50, 60 years after the Civil War, they may not be paid as much as a white person would have been paid. So there was definitely discrimination there. One thing significant, like the Red Summer of 1919, there was a lot of lynchings by mobs, and a lot of times of lynchings of African Americans, and a lot of times it was over things like wanting to be paid a fair wage. It wasn't necessarily always accusation of a violent crime, and then even if it was a violent crime, a lot of times there wasn't enough evidence. It was just prejudice and racism, honestly. Anyway, those types of things really held minorities back. It prevented them from building wealth. There was more of a survival mindset, because it really was survival. Like it's not about putting back so I can retire. It's about how am I going to put food on the table tonight. And so over time, white people are afforded basic human rights and privilege, and they make fair wages. They can own property, and it's been proven over time, especially watching family lines, that home ownership is one of the top ways to build wealth in our country. And that's a whole other thing in and of itself, as far as the prejudice and discrimination that has been in our housing market in the past. So, and I'm surprised even too, a lot of people, I'll say like, they'll say, what laws, what policies have made African Americans at a disadvantage? And I'll say, well, I mean, there are, now it is hard to find a law with specific language that is overtly racist. It's more of like, this may or may not have been our intent when we made this law, but the impact is racist. That's more of kind of what we're dealing with today. You see that in some voter suppression type issues, and ways to solve crimes, and computer programs even, and they're discovering some things. But back in the early to mid 20th century, there were overtly racist laws and policies, such as redlining. I will say redlining, I don't know if I said this before, I kind of got off track, but I have said like, oh, redlining, and people are like, what's redlining? And so a quick synopsis of redlining. City planning and mortgage companies and banks, lenders, would look at a map of the city, and they would siphon off certain portions of the city in different colors, green, yellow, red, based on income and different things like that. Well, people with lower income tended to be people of color. So you had entire sections of cities redlined around as being low income and not good candidates for home loans. And those sections were where the minorities would typically live. And so basically what cities did was they said, okay, this is the black section of town. This is the Hispanic section of town. This is the white section of town, and so on. This is the Asian portion. And you still see, like, a great example of this today is the city of Chicago. To this day, very, very segregated. And a little history behind that even is after the Civil War, African Americans were freed. As I mentioned before, still a lot of prejudice, still a lot of racism, still a lot of horrific violence and lynchings and all of that. So you had, in the early 20th century, you had what they call the Great Migration. And so lots and lots of African Americans were fleeing the South because of the terror brought on them by, Jim Crow laws, segregation, the KKK, white supremacist groups, and society in general. So there's a reason why cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles have pockets of African Americans in them, because they were trying to escape the brutality and the horrors of what they were enduring in the South. Sadly, when they went to these cities, they were not, I'm not saying it wasn't any better, but the lawmakers and the government took advantage of them by making it to where it was almost impossible to get a home loan. And then if they were approved for a home loan, oftentimes it was not the same loan, not the same interest rate as a white family could get, meaning that the loan could get more and more expensive over time. They had super, super high interest rates and payments for a much less desirable home or property than a white family might get. And so a lot of black families would lose their homes because they just simply couldn't keep up. Bear in mind, they're probably making significantly less anyway, and you know, they're unable to keep up with their mortgage, so they lose their home, which only furthers the disparity and the gap. So there's a reason why we have this wealth gap now. When you think about, I was born in 1986. It was in the mid 60s when, or really the late 60s, mid to late 60s, when many of the racist laws were eradicated, like segregation and voting rights and things like that. So it was like basically 20 years before I was born. You know, I think I've said this on a video before, but if my parents were African American and I was African American, my parents would have drank out of colored water fountains and had to use colored restrooms in their lifetime. And so it was not that long ago. And so when you think about the prejudice and the racist laws that were in place then, and their lasting effect, there's a reason why there is such a big gap between minorities and white people. Also bearing in mind that white people, generation by generation, build wealth through home ownership and education and other things, whereas, again, many times African Americans, generation through generation, are just trying to make it. And even if they, as soon as, say, redlining was outlawed, they could get a home loan and started doing well. They started right then, which wasn't really the case because, you know, nothing happens overnight, but say it was, white families would still have potentially hundreds of years of net wealth building, whereas they're starting from square one. Minorities would be starting at square one. So in a nutshell, that kind of is why we have such a big wealth gap today. And there's other things, and we'll get into it in another video because I think this is something that it's quite a rabbit hole. There are so many different facets to this that add to widening the gap further. And so I look forward to talking about these more in the future. A really good example, trying to be careful because I know these people and I'm not in the business of exploiting anyone, but I know of a older couple who actually bought their first home in 1965. It was not a huge house. It was like a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, very simple, what we would call now a starter home, which cracks me up. But anyway, and they paid $11,000 for it. It was 2 or 3 years old, I think, at the time that they bought it. So it was pretty new. They made payments on it, and I was talking to her, and she said she didn't think that their payments were like, they may have been like $50 or something like that a month, which it was significant for then. It wouldn't obviously be significant as much now, but so they paid their home off in the earlier than their 30-year mortgage. They paid more once they were able. They made extra payments or doubled their payments towards the end and were able to pay it off earlier. Fast forward to today. They lived in that home since 1965. There was retirement. They were actually able to take out a loan, 30-ish years ago, to help some family. They took out a reverse mortgage on their property in order to help out family. So they had that available to them. And these people they were not college educated. They were very working class, had ordinary jobs and that sort of thing. So they were never like wealthy by most American standards. Anyway, fast forward to today, they're looking at needing to not live on their own anymore. They're getting up in age, so they have made arrangements to move to a place where they will have some assisted living type deal. And so they're putting their home on the market, and they're getting $250,000 for their home. This is a home that they paid $11,000 for in 1965. So that's just a little nugget of our real life story of people that I know that kind of illustrates the building of wealth and what home ownership and property ownership does for a family economically. So anyway, I hope that this has been informative. If you have any questions or comments or opinions, please comment below. If you have a difference of opinion, you're welcome to voice that. As always, please keep things respectful. If you have, ugly comments, it will be deleted, but not because your opinion is different than mine. It would be because you're choosing to express that in a really unkind way. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Hoping to be back with you soon. Stay safe and well, and love well.